It's a supreme crisis. I'm Jessica Denson, host of Lights On with Jessica Denson. We must do more to confront the corruption at the Supreme Court, and we can. Our nation's preeminent constitutional scholar is calling on the Senate to subpoena Justice Samuel Alito in light of the appalling revelation that he flew an upside-down flag outside his home in the wake of January 6th, a known symbol of support for Donald Trump's Stop the Steal movement. It's always an honor to be joined by my guest today, Harvard constitutional law professor Laurence Tribe. Professor Tribe, welcome back to Lights On.
Thank you, Jessica. It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much. So wonderful to have you back. And especially right now, this is such a vital moment with this Supreme Court hearing multiple cases on January 6th. Of course, the most significant being this obscene presidential immunity bid by Donald Trump. And you have these sitting justices. First, we had all of the revelations about Ginny Thomas with Justice Thomas. Now, Samuel Alito, we know, was flying an upside-down flag outside of his home. I want to get to what you want the Senate to do, but can you just give me your thoughts off the bat on what we're dealing with?
I think we're dealing with a serious crisis of legitimacy in the highest court in the land. I think it is a cliche by now that the highest court should not have the lowest standards, and yet it does. The code of ethics that applies to all judges and justices, enacted by Congress, is completely unenforceable when it comes to justices. That is unacceptable. The law is clear that if the circumstances would create either a conflict of interest or an appearance of impropriety, an appearance that one of the justices has some skin in the game, some stake in the outcome, a commitment to a particular point of view that would make it unfair, really, for that justice to sit in judgment on the question, then that justice must recuse him or herself. There's no question about it. And it even mentions the case of a justice whose spouse is involved in a case. Now, here it is not Justice Alito's spouse, although he tried to throw his wife under the bus in order to escape accountability for that obscene flying of the American flag upside down. This is not a case like Ginny Thomas, who has her own separate career. And so if we are to believe the Thomases, they don't have any pillow talk, they don't share any confidences about the court. To me, that's BS, but it, at least on the surface, raises a question of whether we should recognize the independence of the spouses. That's fine. But this was Samuel Alito's house. He's not suggesting that he and his wife are separated. He saw the flag. He knew it was there. The whole Supreme Court of the United States, we now know, was made aware of it. It was flying at a time when everyone understood that that message, which is supposed to be a SOS symbol for a military emergency, was being used, as you say, quite obscenely, in order to signal sympathy with the insurrection, the overthrow of the United States government by preventing the smooth and lawful and peaceful transition of power from the loser of a presidential election to the winner. For the first time in our history, that transition was interrupted, and it was interrupted by people whose claims are before the U.S. Supreme Court and were pending before the court at the time when Samuel Alito had the terrible judgment of openly signaling his sympathy with the insurrectionists. For him to sit in judgment over the cases involving Donald Trump, the Colorado case where the Supreme Court decided, I think wrongly, that the disqualification of oath-breaking insurrectionists could not be enforced by a state court subject to Supreme Court review. And the current case that is pending in the court involving the absurd claim of absolute immunity by an ex-president for committing crimes in order to try to remain in office beyond his term. These cases are pending, as is another case, the case involving a man named Fisher, who was convicted under an obstruction of Congress statute, which is one of the statutes involved in the pending prosecution of Donald Trump in Tanya Chutkan's court in the Southern District of New York. That case is also pending. What is the scope of that statute? Does it apply to offenses that do not involve document destruction? That could bear on the pending case. And yet Samuel Alito is just twiddling his thumbs, sitting there, and in fact, probably holding up the decision in a way that will prevent the former president from being held accountable unless he is defeated this November. This is a crisis that we simply cannot live with if we're going to have an effective U.S. Supreme Court that we can rely on fairly to adjudicate critical questions about the meaning and application of the United States Constitution and of the laws of the United States.
Absolutely, Professor Tribe. I'm so glad you touched on the illegitimacy of what is going on here. And I definitely want to wrap this interview with your thoughts on what this Supreme Court needs to do in that immunity case. It is absolutely vital to the preservation of our democracy that Donald Trump gets tried before the election. But I want to talk to you specifically about your calls for the Senate to use the tools it has to subpoena Justice Alito. I know you tweeted over the weekend in response to Senate Judiciary Chairman Dick Durbin's comment that Samuel Alito should recuse from these cases. You said talk is cheap. In other words, use the power you have. Can you explain what you would like the Senate to do? And I know just Monday, Senator Durbin said, again, just reiterated his calls for his recusal, but did not articulate any plans to investigate or subpoena Alito. Tell us what needs to be done here.
I'm very glad that Senator Durbin, as the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, at a minimum called for the recusal of Samuel Alito in the cases now pending before the court that are very much involved in the lead up to the insurrection of January 6th and the insurrection. But that's not enough. Calling for his recusal when he has thumbed his nose at the law in so many ways and in so many of his public speeches, starting with his interruption of then President Obama during the State of the Union message, where he muttered under his breath, but in a way that was caught on all of the cameras for hundreds of millions of people to see, not true, when the former president was correctly describing the way the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United would open the floodgates to foreign influence. From that point on, Samuel Alito has been a bad boy on the court. And he has made clear that simply calling for him to behave is not enough. He serves not for life, but during good behavior. That's the language of the Constitution. It is settled that any judge or justice who commits high crimes and misdemeanors, and that certainly includes giving aid and comfort to an insurrection against the Constitution of the United States, which is close to treason, that any such person is subject to impeachment by the House of Representatives. Obviously, this House of Representatives is not going to impeach Samuel Alito. It is very much in league with Donald Trump. He controls Mike Johnson, but he's subject to impeachment and then trial in the Senate. The very fact that the House of Representatives will not do its duty is not an excuse for the Senate not to at least initiate serious investigation into whether impeachable offenses have been committed, and in any event, whether an enforceable, meaningfully enforceable code of ethics, enforceable by an inspector general, whether that should be enacted. That's something within the Senate's purview as well. to have that kind of investigation without Samuel Alito being called to testify, and if you won't testify, voluntarily being subpoenaed, is like playing Hamlet without the prince. He is, in this scenario, the prince, perhaps the prince of darkness. He needs to be heard from. He needs to be asked what he meant by allowing that symbol of sympathy with insurrectionists to fly in front of his home. It's not enough for him to say casually to the Fox News service, "Oh, that was just my wife," responding to nasty comments about FU to Trump and to us by our neighbors. As far as I can tell, it seems that his defense for unethical behavior and worse, for expressing aid and comfort to an insurrection against the Constitution, is that his neighbors were exercising their First Amendment rights in a way that he thought was not going to be nice for his children, I guess. That's what he says his wife was concerned about.
His children aren't even school age, and it was during COVID, so there were no school buses running during that time.
Right. So it's a lie. It's a flat out lie. Let him do it under oath. And if he refuses to show up in response to a subpoena, claiming some new kind of judicial privilege, it doesn't exist. He could be held in contempt and should be. He has been contemptuous for quite a while. It's about time that he be held to account.
Couldn't agree more. To quote Stephen Colbert, Samuel Alito's defense was essentially, "You're rude to my wife. We're Nazis now." But yeah, absolutely.
Count on Stephen.
Yeah, you can. Obviously, we need some comic relief, but this is not a laughing matter. It is so vitally serious, consequential. Professor Tribe, before you leave us today, I certainly hope that the Senate Judiciary Committee is listening to your calls. I know that other members of that committee, Senator Alex Padilla, even Mitt Romney, and believe it or not, Lindsey Graham showed openness to an investigation of this sort. Absolutely. Who are we to blame if we don't even use the tools at our disposal? But I want to tell me your thoughts, if you would, on what needs to happen with this presidential immunity case right now to salvage legitimacy from this court and get this trial in DC back on track.
Well, the court needs to decide the case. It's not a difficult case. The issue properly presented to the court is whether a former president is immune from prosecution, absolutely immune, for conduct in his political capacity, not official conduct like appointing justices or appointing cabinet members or issuing pardons, but political conduct like pressuring Mr. Raffensperger to, quote, find, unquote, 11,000 and some odd number of votes in order to overturn the formal certification of a lawfully completed election. Whether a former president who does that by violating various laws about obstructing Congress and the like, and by committing crimes, at least allegedly, in the violation of those laws, is simply immune from standing trial, like some kind of king or emperor. The answer is obviously no, and that's the answer the U.S. Supreme Court is bound to give. But it has slow-walked the thing by complicating everything, by saying, oh, well, that might be the answer for this case, but we don't want to talk about this case. It was people like Alito and Gorsuch who said, no, we want to write for the ages. Well, it can take ages to write for the ages. They don't have that function. They have the function of deciding this case. And they've already held it too long. They could have decided it back in December. They could have decided it long ago. It was April 25th that they heard the argument. Come on, guys, get your act together. It's not too late tomorrow for them to issue a decision. But of course, as a practical matter, with people like Alito and probably Gorsuch and Thomas, rubbing their brows and saying they need more time to write their dissents. The Chief Justice, who has really shown very little spine and who has no formal authority to force people like Alito to stop sabotaging the court and wrecking its reputation, I'm afraid he's simply letting them do what they want to do. It's not too late, Mr. Chief Justice. My former student, John Roberts, you're a smart man. You care about the country. You care about the Constitution. I hope you are listening. Get off your butt. I'm sorry to say it that bluntly. You have the capacity to shame your colleagues into being decent human beings, following the rule of law, deciding the case before them. If they want time to write a fancy dissent later on, that can be published after a majority of the court says to Tanya Chutkan, go ahead, you can conduct this trial. She's made it clear that she's already going to have an 80 or 88-day waiting period after the court gives her a green light to give Donald Trump and his lawyers a chance to prepare for the trial. I'm not sure she needed to do that, but she's going to keep that promise. It's already almost too late to get that trial going before the election. It could have been over by now if the U.S. Supreme Court hadn't dragged it out. But it is not necessarily too late. But the cost for the court and the country, if the court pursues the current course of doing nothing, not announcing a decision one way or the other until it's too late, and then perhaps Donald Trump gets elected president again, and then he fires any attorney general who won't do his bidding and dismiss this case altogether. So the net effect is he may never be held to account for trying to overthrow the government of the United States and to prevent the transition of power to the president who won the election. That is the most serious crime a sitting president can commit, trying to prevent fair election from removing him from office. That's the rock bottom, the basic difference between dictatorial power and a president who is a president of, by, and for the people. If he says, I won't accept the result of an election unless I've won, and he's pretty much saying that now, but he tried to say it in 2020. He tried to hold on to power. He committed crimes in doing it. He's got to be held accountable. And if the Supreme Court cares about preserving its integrity, its institutional credibility, and it really should, then Mr. Chief Justice, do something.
In the words of your professor, Laurence Tribe, get off your butt, issue this decision. Professor Tribe, thank you so much for your clarity, your words of wisdom. I don't think I can overstate how valuable your contribution is to our democracy, and I'm so grateful that you're sharing your voice with us.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on this special edition of Lights On. As always, you can subscribe to Lights On with Jessica Denson wherever you get your audio podcasts, and always find the Lights On special episodes and live episodes on the Jessica Denson YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone.